everybody. Okay, chapter 6, verse 9. Eila told us Noach, these are the generations of Noach. Noach is tzaddik tamim hayab dorosav. Noach was righteous, perfect. These are two words. Tzaddik, righteous, tamim, perfect, purely. It could very well mean he was a pure tzaddik, and it could be that tamim is a description of being a tzaddik. But we'll talk about this soon, God willing. What's the difference, or what's the references to being tzaddik and tamim in his generations? That, of course, is a strange thing to say. What does it mean he was a tzaddik in his generations, as opposed to what? We'll talk about that too. Esu Elokim Esalech Noach. God walked with Noach. Also an interesting phrase. What does that mean? Actually, it's really more like Noach walked with God. What does that mean? Let's start with the Ramban. Second Ramban on the pasuk. Second Ramban on pasuk Tes. Is tzaddik tamim haya. Yaskir HaKasav, the Torah is informing us Shayazakai v'shalem b'tzidka, that he was complete in his piety. Lohodia sheroy li notzel min hamabul she'ein lo onesh klal. You know, Rashi says that the idea is that the moment we say Noach's name, it's like Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Whenever we mention a righteous person, we should say something good about them. That's why Rashi says, why we jump in with the fact that he was a tzaddik. Obviously, one could pose the question, not just what do the terms tzaddik and tamim mean, but what's it even relevant to the point right now? So the Ramban says, we're explaining that he deserved to be saved from the flood. You know, you might have thought that God just needs to start over with somebody. So, you know, who's the best candidate? Or maybe even if you're really cynical, you'll say, who's the least bad person around? Noach, you're the one for the job. So the Torah is telling us wrong. He was really a tzaddik. He was really a tamim. He really did not deserve to die in this flood. So the Ramban says, Ki hu tamim b'tzedek. He was complete in his being a tzaddik. And now the Ramban says, let's explain what that means. Ki ha tzaddik hu hazakai b'din. You know, when we use the word tzaddik, we think it means, wow, they're just a really great person. The Ramban says, at its core, tzaddik means a person who is innocent in judgment. It's a very famous pasuk that talks about the Beis Din process. Without getting into the detail of the broader context of the pasuk, the Torah talks about Beis Din making a judgment, and they render the tzaddik a tzaddik, and they render the rasha a rasha. So what does that mean? That means just because you won a case in Beis Din, they start singing songs in your honor. You must be such a big tzaddik. What's meant by that? So Ramban says, you know what the pshat in the pasuk is? The pshat in the pasuk is tzaddik just means you're correct in this question. Rasha just means you're wrong in this question. So when we talk about how God views a person, we're coming off of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So in the question of what their year should be like, they're a tzaddik, they're a rasha, they deserve a good judgment, they don't deserve a good judgment. But the Ramban says what it means in this context is Noach deserved to be saved from the Mabul. That's what the meaning of the word tzaddik is here. Regarding the question on the ledger, he is justified in his case. And on that, the Torah says tamim, that he was absolutely justified in being saved from the Mabul. It wasn't just, you know, he was the best one left standing. Okay, let's go on. A few lines later in the Ramban, in mine it's the next paragraph. So the Ramban says we're saying he's a person who's a tzaddik, meaning the other people around him are doing all this terrible stuff. They're stealing from people. They're being sexually immoral. Amar Hashem hanichbad liyiro solavado. Then it says he walked with God. What does that mean? It means that he lived with reverence for God and God alone. Einenu nifteh achar hovrei shamayim. He wasn't seduced by all the crazy things going on in the world. Certainly wasn't impressed by idol worship. Wouldn't listen to any of that stuff at all. He only was connected to Hashem and Hashem alone. And he walked upon the path which God chose. So it's interesting because if we understand tzaddik as not meaning, was he a bigger tzaddik than Avram? Was he a lesser tzaddik than Avram? It just means he deserved to be saved. Then you might say, I guess he just wasn't the total Russia like the rest of them. So after we say that he deserved to be saved because he wasn't at all sinful in the way that they were sinful, we clarify he really walked with God. He really lived his life in the right way. That's how the Ramban explains this pasuk. Now, what's the thing about Bedoro Sav in his generations? So first he starts off quoting the Rashi, Yesh Mirabus, next Ramban, and Bedoro Sav, Yesh Mirabus, Seinu Shedarshu Latova. There are those who say it as a compliment. Koshkim in Hayabedor Shal Tzadikim, that it's saying, gosh, even in those generations, Noach was still a good person. Imagine how good he would have been if he actually had good people to be with. And there are those who say it as a criticism. Yeah, by the standards of that generation, he was a tzaddik. If you would have compared him to people from a greater time, he wouldn't have been so great. Lashon Rashi. That's a famous Rashi that he says both ways. Ramban says, what I think the pshat is over here, Kitamo Lomar Shuhu Levado Hatzadik Bedoros Hahem. He says, you know what the real pshat is? He was the only person in those times who deserved to be saved from the flood. So again, because the Ramban is clearly moving away from making these broad statements about Noach based on the term tzaddik, it means he deserved to be saved. So you know what it means in his generations? It means of that time period, he was the only one who deserved to be saved. Ein b'doros of tzaddik v'lo tam zulaso. There was no one comparable to him. V'chein ki oschar reisi tzaddik l'fonai b'dor hazeh. That's what God says to him, says the Ramban. Later on in this parsha, God says to Noach, I see you as a tzaddik before me in this generation. Meaning, says the Ramban, she'ein acher b'dor royally natzel. It's you and you alone. That's why he says in this generation, there's no one else of the time who deserves to be saved. V'yomer b'doro sav. Now, why would it say in his generations? Isn't that an interesting thing? It's true, he lived a long time, but according to the Ramban, the point is all about right now. Who deserves to be saved right now? So what's it to do with his generations? Kidoros rabim avru me'es she'eschisu. From the time that things really started going downhill in the world, and there was so much immorality, the ein tzaddik ba'aretz bilto, for that whole time span, he was the only tzaddik around. I'm sure some of you are thinking about this, but a famous medrash that Mesushelach was a great person, and actually Mesushelach died right before the flood. So what do you mean Noach was the only tzaddik of his times? How could you say that? Because again, this is Ramban's point again. We're not saying, let's make a top 10 list of tzaddikim from those times. Who was a really good person? Who should we write a book about? That's not the point. The point is, he was the only one who deserved to be saved from the flood. So Mesushelach didn't deserve to be saved from the flood. Whatever God's plans were for Mesushelach, God's plans were that Mesushelach would die before the flood. So that's a whole different calculation, says Ramban. But of the ones who were going to perish and who were going to live during the flood, Noach was the only one who deserved to be saved. Just an interesting pshat. We're very familiar with the Midrashim on the pasuk, but interesting pshat from the Ramban. One more thing on this, actually, another thing on the pasuk. Sforno, Eso Elokim Esalach Noach. Noach walked with God. It's like the fourth sforno on this pasuk. Now we said the Ramban said that means that Noach lived with great reverence for God. Sforno says as follows: Halach b'drachav. He walked in the ways of God. We have a quote elsewhere in the Torah, V'alachta b'drachav. You should go in the path of God. That means you should act in a certain type of way, beyond keeping the mitzvahs. Of course, we should keep the commandments, but it has another connotation. Lehetiv l'zulaso. He did good to other people. V'ochiach b'rei doro. He tried to move the people of his generation to change. So what we're saying is it was more than he basically did the right thing and wasn't immoral. He was a good person to others. That's the point, says this word about walking with God. Now, let's go to the Kli Yakar. It's the second Kli Yakar on Pasuk Tes. Ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorosav. So we've already discussed what the Ramban says on that. We've already discussed the Ramban. The Kli Yakar says something else. The Kli Yakar says, Lefi shedor hamabul hishchisu hisivu b'shlosha minei hashchasas sheniskru b'parsha ve'imavodah zara hili arayos v'gezel. There are famous lessons from the psukim that there were basically three major sins of the time. idol worship, inappropriate sexual relations, and theft. These were the big three. Okay, hiktim lomar shenoach hayagador b'shlashtam. So therefore, says the Kli Yakar, we're conveying that Noach conducted himself appropriately on all three fronts. Ki ish tzaddik, what does it mean he was righteous? Again, the most literal connotation, besides the Ramban's point, the most literal connotation of tzaddik is someone did the right thing. He didn't take things that didn't belong to him. So the fact that he said tzaddik means he was diligent about not taking other people's things, unlike the people of the time. Tamim hayabadoro sav, he was pure. He was pure, says the Kli Yakar, means he wasn't involved in inappropriate sexual activities. As well, Kim, Salach Noach. Noach walked with God, lo pana, lo mimachirim. He didn't turn to other gods. He walked with God and wasn't involved in idol worship. So a very interesting pshat in the Kli Yakar. So each of these descriptions of Noach in this pasuk is clarifying that he wasn't involved with one of the major sins at the time. I should also mention, it was in the Ramban. I must have accidentally skipped it. I apologize for that. I believe it's the Ibn Ezra that he cites that he's pshat in tzaddik and tamim, if I remember correctly. His tzaddik was he acted in the right way, he did the right things, and tamim, he was pure of heart. His attitude, his outlook was appropriate. Okay, let's jump ahead to verse 13. Vayomer Elokim Noach, God said to Noach, Kates kol basar ba'alefonai, the end of all flesh has come before me, ki malah haaretz chamas lifneihem, because the world is full of, this is normally translated as theft. Before them, the world is full of theft, so I'm going to end life as we know it in this world. And behold, I will destroy them along with the world. Now, this is really interesting. We just said a moment ago that there were various sins, three big ones: sexual immorality, idol worship, and theft. So why is God zeroing in on theft? Interesting Ramban. First Ramban on Pasuk Gimel, Chamas, Gezel Oshek. Also just generally treating people inappropriately. God mentions theft and doesn't mention general immorality. Because theft was this very known and public thing. You know, there's a famous Gemara that the real sealing of the judgment was because of the theft. Vahatam, why is this so? Why are we emphasizing so much theft? It's a logical thing. You don't need a prophet to tell you it's wrong to reach into someone's pocket and take their thing. Okay? So that's why Hashem really didn't have tolerance for them. They're doing something that they know to be wrong. They're doing something they know they wouldn't want done to them. Okay, maybe a person doesn't understand the theology and they're worshiping idols instead of God. Maybe they need better education. Maybe they don't see the problem in having different sexual relationships. But theft, you don't get it? How would you feel if someone took something from you? Another interesting thing about theft is the person's acting in an immoral way and they're wronging another person. There's a lot of immoral things we can do that are between us and God, but this is doubly wrong. And so therefore God emphasizes this chait to Noach. So we spoke about various ideas in terms of tzaddik tamim. We spoke about two ideas in terms of Bedoro Sab and his generations. We spoke about some ideas of what it means that Noach walked with God. And we spoke about, with the Ramban, why it specifies sin. Why it specifies theft, excuse me.